I've always been someone who valued my privacy. After spending my 20s crammed into thin-walled apartment buildings where I could hear my neighbors coughing, arguing, and watching TV at all hours of the night, I finally saved up enough to buy my own place. It was a massive steal, a sprawling two-story colonial in a quiet, older suburb. The house had been built in the late 70s and had that slightly drafty, over-engineered feel to it. It featured a complex, almost labyrinthian layout, a sprawling, unfinished basement, ridiculously deep closets that stretched back into the darkness, and large, industrial-style louvered vents for the central heating that looked like they belonged in a hotel rather than a single-family home. Because I lived alone, the sheer size of the place felt a little isolating at first. It wasn't that the nearest neighbors were miles away, it was just that the house itself felt vast and empty. My footsteps echoed off the original hardwood floors, bouncing down the long, shadowed hallway of the second floor. But I loved it. For the first time in my life, I had absolute silence. Or so I thought. The excitement of homeownership began to curdle on the very first night. I had spent 14 hours hauling boxes, assembling basic furniture, and scrubbing floors. By 10 p.m., I was completely dead on my feet. I ordered a large pepperoni pizza, ate 3 slices while sitting on a moving box in the living room, and shoved the rest into the brand new, otherwise completely empty refrigerator. I crashed on my mattress, which was currently just lying flat on the floor in the master bedroom. That's when I first noticed the house's weird acoustics. Old houses settle, everyone knows that. Wood expands and contracts as the temperature drops, but the sounds this house made didn't sound like wood settling. It sounded hollow. Deep inside the walls, I'd hear a dull thump, followed by a faint dragging sound that seemed to travel vertically up the drywall from the floor below, eventually fading into the ceiling above me. I laid there in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan, trying to convince myself it was just the old plumbing or the massive HVAC system kicking into gear. Eventually, sheer physical exhaustion pulled me under. I woke up around 3 a.m. My mouth felt like sandpaper. Groggy and disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness, I stumbled out of my bedroom, navigating the labyrinth of unpacked boxes in the hallway, and made my way downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. I opened the fridge, the harsh internal light blinding me for a second. When my eyes adjusted, I froze. The pizza box was sitting exactly where I had left it on the middle shelf, but the cardboard lid was flipped back, and it was completely empty. I stood there for a solid minute, bathed in the cold light of the refrigerator, trying to process what I was seeing. Had I eaten the whole thing? No, that was impossible. I distinctly remember feeling painfully full after 3 slices and boxing up the remaining 5. I lived alone. The doors were deadbolted from the inside. All the ground floor windows were locked. My exhausted brain tried to force a rational explanation. Maybe I sleepwalked? I'd never sleptwalked a day in my life, but what other logical explanation was there? Feeling a sudden irrational chill crawl up the back of my neck, I slowly shut the fridge door. The kitchen was plunged back into darkness, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds. I turned to walk back to the stairs, my bare feet padding softly against the cold linoleum. As I passed the large floor-level ventilation grate tucked into the shadowed corner of the dining room, my foot caught on something gritty. I reached out, blindly flicking on the hallway light switch. There, stark and undeniable against the pristine, freshly polished hardwood floor, was a single, massive footprint. It was rendered in dark, wet mud. But the muddy shape wasn't what sent a spike of pure, unadulterated terror straight through my chest. It was the position of it. The footprint was planted directly in front of the oversized louvered vent, and the toes were pointing outward. Whatever had tracked mud into my new home hadn't come in through the front door. It had crawled out of my walls. I stared at the wet, gritty outline of the foot. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, loud enough that I swore it echoed in the empty kitchen. My survival instincts overrode my exhaustion. I grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a solid metal mag light from an unpacked box on the counter, and spent the next hour clearing my own house like a heavily caffeinated, terrified one-man SWAT team. I checked every room, throwing open closet doors and shining the beam under the stairs, behind shower curtains, and into the dark, dusty corners of the basement. I found absolutely nothing. Every single window was locked shut. The deadbolts on the front and back doors were still thrown. Sweating and shaking, I gravitated back to the dining room vent. I dropped to my knees and inspected it closely. The thick metal louvers were screwed securely into the drywall. The screws themselves were caked in decades-old beige paint, clearly untouched. My exhausted brain immediately scrambled for a lifeline, desperate to build a bridge of logic over a chasm of pure panic. The movers, I told myself, my breathing finally slowing down. One of the movers must have stepped in mud, stood near the vent while carrying something heavy, and I just didn't notice it in the chaos. The wetness? Probably just condensation dripping from the AC unit above. It was a flimsy, pathetic excuse, but when you are entirely alone in a massive, dark house at 3 a.m, you will cling to any lie that allows you to turn the lights off. I grabbed a wet paper towel, scrubbed the muddy print from the hardwood until my knuckles ached, and went back to bed with a heavy kitchen knife resting on my nightstand. Over the next 3 weeks, the pizza incident and the footprint faded into a bizarre, sleep-deprived memory. I fell into a comfortable routine of working, unpacking, and trying to make the sprawling house feel like a home. But the house never fully let me relax. It started with the little things, the subtle, insidious anomalies that forced you to gaslight yourself before you ever suspect an intruder. I would come home from my 9 to 5, unlock the front door, and immediately feel a subtle, sickening shift in the atmosphere. The air in the hallway would smell faintly sour. It was a stale, metallic odor, like unwashed clothes and old sweat, hovering specifically near the deep closets in the upstairs hallway. I blamed it on the musty basement air circulating through the vents, and bought plug-ins for every outlet. Then it was my belongings. I have a rigid, almost neurotic habit of dropping my keys in a ceramic bowl by the front door the second I walk in. One Tuesday, they were gone. I spent 20 agonizing minutes tearing the living room apart, only to find them sitting perfectly centered on the kitchen island. I chalked it up to being distracted by my phone. 2 days later, a kitchen cabinet I knew for an absolute fact I had closed was hanging wide open when I came downstairs in the morning. I started feeling like I was losing my mind, slowly deteriorating in isolation. But the turning point, the moment the creeping dread solidified into undeniable terror, happened on a rainy Thursday night. I was reading in bed. The house was dead quiet, except for the steady drumming of rain lashing against the bedroom window. Then, underneath the sound of the storm, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from inside the drywall, directly behind my headboard. A distinct, rhythmic knocking. I froze, the book slipping slightly in my sweaty hands. I desperately tried to rationalize it. It's mice. It's water dripping from a leaky pipe hitting a wooden stud. But the cadence was too deliberate, too heavy and muffled. It sounded fleshy, like a knuckle rapping against the interior wood. Slowly, trying not to make a sound, I leaned over and pressed my ear against the cold, painted drywall. The tapping stopped instantly. Complete, suffocating silence. I waited for a full minute, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. Feeling foolish and trying to prove to myself that it was just my overactive imagination, I raised my hand and knocked back against the wall with my knuckles. Knock, knock. 2 sharp, casual raps. I waited. 10 seconds passed, then 20. I let out a long breath I didn't realize I was holding, a nervous smile touching my lips as I turned back to my book. Then, from the dark void directly on the other side of the drywall, mere inches from my ear, came the deliberate reply. Knock, knock. I shot out of bed so fast I tangled my legs in the sheets and hit the hardwood floor hard. My shoulder slammed into the nightstand, sending the heavy kitchen knife clattering into the dark. I didn't care. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, pressing my spine against the opposite wall, my wide eyes locked on the blank expanse of drywall above my mattress. I waited for the wall to burst open. I waited for a muffled voice. I waited for anything. But the house just sat there, suffocatingly quiet. Only the steady drumming of the rain against the window pane filled the silence. I sat on the floor for what felt like hours, my chest heaving, listening to the adrenaline-fueled roar of blood in my ears. Desperately, I tried to apply logic to the impossible. Thermal expansion, I told myself, my teeth actually chattering in the chilly room. Water hammer in the ancient plumbing. A raccoon in the crawl space mimicking the sound. But raccoons don't understand call and response, and water pipes don't wait patiently for their turn. I didn't sleep in that room for the rest of the night. I grabbed my blanket, stepped out into the hall, and locked the bedroom door from the outside. A completely ridiculous gesture, considering whatever made the noise was supposedly inside the walls. I slept curled up on the living room sofa with the television glaring on mute, the heavy mag light resting on my chest. The next morning, the harsh, unforgiving daylight made me feel like an absolute idiot. I drank 3 cups of black coffee and convinced myself I was suffering from severe sleep deprivation. Stress can cause auditory hallucinations, right? Moving is notoriously stressful. I was just cracking under the pressure of being utterly alone in this massive, drafty echo chamber of a house. But the seed of paranoia had firmly taken root. Over the next week, the house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a predator waiting for me to turn my back. The sour, metallic smell I had noticed days earlier began to seep into the downstairs hallway, hovering aggressively right beneath the central intake vent. It was the distinct, sickening odor of unwashed hair and stale sweat. I bought industrial-strength bleach and scrubbed the intake grate until my knuckles were raw, but the smell always crept back by nightfall. I started paying hyper-focused, obsessive attention to my environment. The architecture of the house suddenly felt wrong. Why were the upstairs hallway closets so incredibly deep that the back walls were swallowed in shadow? Why did the ceiling in the guest bathroom seem a foot lower than the ceiling in the adjacent hallway? I decided to run a test, a stupid, childish test, just to prove to myself once and for all that I was losing my mind and nothing more. Before leaving for work on Tuesday morning, I took a single strand of clear sewing thread and taped it low across the doorframe of the spare bedroom at the end of the hall, a room I never used and kept completely shut. It was a classic paranoid trick. If the thread was broken when I got home, it meant the door had been opened while I was out. I spent the entire workday anxious, my leg bouncing uncontrollably under my desk. When I finally pulled into the driveway at 6 p.m., the house loomed over me, its dark upper windows looking like empty, watchful eyes. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The sour smell was there, thicker and more metallic than before. I dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl, gripped my heavy flashlight, and slowly walked up the stairs. The old wood shrieked under my weight. I reached the end of the long hallway and looked down. My heart did a slow, painful flip in my chest, and the blood drained entirely from my face. The door to the spare bedroom was still shut tight, but the clear thread wasn't just broken. It had been carefully untaped from the frame, tied into a perfect, minuscule knot, and left resting deliberately in the dead center of the hallway floor. I stared down at that tiny, perfect knot resting on the hardwood. My lungs stopped working. A broken thread could be a draft or a clumsy mistake, but a knot? A knot was a message. It was a cold, calculated smirk from the dark. Someone had crouched right where I was standing, untaped my pathetic trap, tied it, and left it there to say, "I see you." My first instinct was to run outside and call the police. But what was I going to report? "Officer, someone ate my pizza and tied a knot in a piece of thread." There were no broken windows. The deadbolts were perfectly intact. They would take one look at my bloodshot eyes and the heavy flashlight in my white-knuckled grip and politely suggest I see a psychiatrist. Instead, I retreated downstairs, locked myself in the kitchen, and ordered 4 motion-activated Wi-Fi cameras with overnight delivery. That night, I didn't even pretend to sleep. I sat at the kitchen island with the lights blazing and a heavy cast-iron skillet next to my coffee mug, listening. The house was agonizingly loud. Every groan of the foundation sounded like footsteps, but the most terrifying sound was the subtle shifting above the ceiling. It wasn't rats. Rats scurry. This was a heavy, slow, cautious transfer of weight. Creak, a pause, creak. Someone was crawling on their hands and knees through the space between the first-floor ceiling and the second-floor floorboards. The cameras arrived the next afternoon. I tore open the boxes and set them up immediately, one pointing at the front door, one in the kitchen, one covering the upstairs hallway, and one aimed directly at the massive louvered vent in the dining room. I synced them to my phone, cranked the motion sensitivity to maximum, and went to work feeling a grim, desperate sense of triumph. I spent my entire shift staring at the live feeds. Nothing. Just empty, sunlit rooms. When I got home, the sour smell was overpowering, hitting me the second I opened the door. I checked the app. No motion alerts. Feeling a fragile, false sense of security, I walked into the kitchen. That's when I noticed the camera on the counter. I had angled it perfectly to capture the entire room. Now it was turned exactly 90 degrees, staring blankly at the side of the refrigerator. Ice water flooded my veins. I pulled out my phone and checked the recording history. There was a single 2-second clip from 1:14 p.m. It showed the kitchen, empty and still. Then a pale, grimy hand with brutally long, dirt-caked fingernails reached up from the blind spot directly beneath the counter. The hand wrapped around the lens, the screen went black with a violent rustling sound, and the clip ended. They hadn't walked past the camera. They had crawled out from under the island cabinets. I backed slowly out of the kitchen, my eyes darting to every vent, every shadow, every slightly ajar door. The game was escalating. I retreated up the stairs, my back pressed against the wall, heading for my bedroom. I slammed the door, threw the lock, and leaned against the wood, gasping for air. As my eyes adjusted to the dim evening light, I looked toward my unmade bed. Sprinkled across the dark blue fabric of my pillowcase was a fine, powdery layer of white dust. I walked over, my legs feeling like lead, and touched it with a trembling finger. Drywall dust. I slowly tilted my head up, looking at the ceiling, and then let my eyes trace the wall down to the dark, cavernous depths of my open closet. I stood frozen beside my bed, staring into the gaping black maw of the closet. The fine, powdery dust on my pillow was undeniable. It wasn't settling dust. It was freshly drilled drywall. My eyes, wide with panic, frantically scanned the wall directly above my headboard, the exact spot where I had heard the rhythmic tapping a week ago. At first, I didn't see it. The paint was a flat, boring eggshell white that hid imperfections well. But as I leaned closer, my nose inches from the drywall, my heart hitched violently. Right at eye level, perfectly centered over where my head rested every night, was a tiny, jagged hole. It was no bigger than the diameter of a pencil lead, bored cleanly through the plaster from the other side. The air in my lungs turned to ice. They hadn't just been listening to me. They had been watching me sleep. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me, so intense I had to grip the edge of the mattress to stay upright. The sour, metallic smell was suddenly suffocating in the small room. I stumbled backward, my eyes locked on the tiny, dark void of the peephole. The sheer, predatory intimacy of it was paralyzing. Someone had spent hours, maybe days, silently scraping away the drywall from the inside of my closet just to watch me breathing in the dark. My survival instinct, buried under weeks of gaslighting myself into submission, finally snapped to life with a jolt of pure adrenaline. I grabbed the heavy mag light from my nightstand, the cold metal grounding me, and slowly turned toward the open closet. The closet in the master bedroom was notoriously deep, a bizarre architectural quirk of the 70s. It extended at least 6 feet back beneath the slope of the roofline, far beyond the single hanging rod. I had shoved a few moving boxes back there on my first day and hadn't looked inside since. I clicked the flashlight on. The harsh white beam sliced through the gloom, illuminating my winter coats and the stack of cardboard boxes. I pushed the coats aside, the hangers screeching metallically against the rod. The sound was deafening in the silent house. I stepped into the closet. The smell of stale sweat and unwashed hair hit me like a physical blow. The back wall of the closet was simple, unfinished drywall. But as I swept the beam down to the floorboards, my breath caught in my throat. Behind the stacked boxes, near the floor, a square section of the drywall had been meticulously cut away. It was a crude, jagged opening, just large enough for a grown adult to squeeze through, leading directly into the dark, dusty void of the house's interior crawlspace. The edges of the cut drywall were smeared with dark, greasy handprints. My hands shook so violently, the flashlight beam danced across the jagged opening. I crouched down, forcing myself to look inside. The crawl space was a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel of wooden studs, fiberglass insulation, and crisscrossing electrical wires that ran the entire length of the second floor. I shone the light deeper into the tunnel. About 10 feet in, nestled between the joists directly behind my bedroom wall, was a makeshift nest. The stench was unbearable now. It was the pungent copper tang of old sweat, rotting food, and the distinct ammonia-like burn of human waste. Every rational survival instinct screamed at me to back out of the closet, sprint out the front door, and never look back. But a morbid, paralyzing compulsion, the desperate need to understand the full scope of my nightmare, forced me to my hands and knees. I squeezed my shoulders through the jagged hole in the drywall, the rough plaster edges scraping my skin, and dragged myself into the suffocating darkness of the crawl space. The air in the walls was dead, thick with decades of accumulated dust and microscopic fiberglass shards that immediately coated the back of my throat. It was a tight, claustrophobic tunnel formed by the roof slope and the ceiling of the first floor. I crawled forward on the wooden joists, terrified that a misplaced knee would send me crashing through the fragile drywall ceiling into the living room below. 10 feet in, I swept the maglite over the nest. It was a horrific monument to violation. Wedged directly behind the drywall of my bedroom, right where the peephole had been drilled, was a flattened, filthy sleeping bag. It was originally blue, but now it was stained almost entirely black with grease, dirt, and grime. Surrounding it was a sickening horde of garbage that answered every question I had desperately tried to ignore. There were empty water bottles filled with dark, cloudy yellow liquid, discarded granola bar wrappers, and sitting on a torn piece of cardboard was the half-eaten crust from my missing pepperoni pizza, now fuzzy with pale green mold. My stomach heaved violently. This person hadn't just been breaking in at night. They had been living inside the skeletal structure of my house, breathing the same air, listening to my every move since the day I moved in, maybe even long before I ever got the keys. I crawled a few inches closer, the wooden beams groaning softly under my shifting weight. Beside the sleeping bag sat a small, battered metal lockbox. The lid was resting open. I reached out with a trembling hand and nudged it with the heavy end of my flashlight. A stack of glossy square papers spilled out onto the pink fiberglass insulation. Polaroids. I picked the top one up, my breathing shallow and erratic. It was a picture of me. I was asleep on my mattress on the floor, taken from a high angle. The closet door was clearly cracked open in the frame. A whimper caught in my throat as I frantically grabbed the next one. It was closer, taken from the foot of my bed. The next one was even closer, a tight, sickening shot of my face, eyes closed, completely oblivious to the absolute stranger standing over me in the dark. The flash hadn't been used. The photos were grainy, illuminated only by the pale streetlights bleeding through my blinds. I flipped them over. Smeared black marker dates were scrawled on the white borders. They spanned the entire 3 weeks I had lived there. The most recent one was dated yesterday. I dropped the photos as if they were coated in acid. I needed to leave. I needed to call the police. I had to get out of the house. I began to frantically scramble backward toward the faint square of light leading back to my closet, my flashlight beam bouncing chaotically against the rafters. But as my boot hit the edge of the drywall exit, a sound froze the blood in my veins. It was a heavy, deliberate creak of bending wood, and it didn't come from downstairs. It came from the plywood boards resting on the joists, no more than 15 feet deeper into the pitch-black tunnel. I stopped breathing entirely. I slowly raised the maglite, my arm trembling so violently the beam stuttered, and pointed it into the deepest, darkest reach of the crawlspace. I pointed the maglite into the black, suffocating void of the crawlspace, my heart slamming against my ribs hard enough to rattle my ribcage. The beam sliced through the floating dust motes, illuminating the rough, exposed beams in pink fiberglass. For a sickening moment, there was nothing. Just the endless dark tunnel stretching toward the opposite end of the house. I let out a shaky, strangled breath, convincing myself it was just the house settling, that old drafty lie I had been telling myself since the day I moved in. I began to push myself backward again, my shoulders scraping against the jagged drywall opening leading back to my closet. Then the beam caught it. About 20 feet down the tunnel, tucked into the narrowest, most claustrophobic corner where the roof sloped down to meet the floor joists, something shifted. It wasn't a rat. It wasn't an optical illusion. It was a mass of dark, filthy fabric slowly uncurling itself from the shadows. A figure was wedged between the wooden beams, perfectly still, perfectly silent. My breath caught in my throat, a physical block of ice forming in my lungs. The person was wearing clothes so saturated with dirt and grease they looked like rotting black leather. Long, matted, greasy hair hung over their face, obscuring their features completely. They were crouched on all fours, their head tilted down, entirely unnatural in their stillness. They had been there the whole time. While I was examining the nest, reading the dates on the Polaroids, dry heaving over the smell, they had just been watching me from the dark. I scrambled backward frantically, my elbow slamming hard into a wooden stud. Pain flared up my arm, but I barely registered it. I needed to get out, now. As I moved, the figure slowly lifted its head. The flashlight beam caught the dull, dead glint of 2 wide, unblinking eyes staring directly at me through the matted hair. There was no fear in those eyes. There was no surprise. There was only the cold, calculated patience of a predator that had finally been cornered in its own territory. And then the worst sound I have ever heard in my life echoed through the confined space. It was a wet, rattling sigh, a long, slow exhalation that sounded entirely too loud in the dead silence of the crawlspace. The figure didn't speak. It didn't yell. It just slowly, deliberately reached out a long, filthy arm, its long, dirt-caked fingernails digging into the plywood board in front of it, and it began to crawl forward. Creak. A slow, heavy transfer of weight. Creak. It moved with sickening fluid grace, entirely accustomed to the tight, treacherous space. It wasn't rushing. It was stalking. It knew I was trapped, wedged halfway through the small drywall opening leading back to my closet. Panic, raw and blinding, exploded in my chest. I threw myself backward into the closet, the jagged drywall tearing through my shirt and scraping deeply across my ribs. I hit the floor of the closet hard, the maglite clattering loudly against the floorboards, its beams spinning crazily before settling on my winter coats. I scrambled to my feet, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I didn't look back. I bolted out of the closet, slammed the door shut, and grabbed the doorknob with both hands, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. But as I leaned my weight against the door, desperate to find a lock that didn't exist, I heard the faint, muffled sound of fabric dragging across the drywall from inside the closet. I slammed my back against the flimsy, hollow-core wood of the closet door, my running shoes slipping frantically on the hardwood as I tried to find traction. My hands clamped over the brass doorknob in a white-knuckled death grip. I didn't have a lock. I didn't have a weapon. My heavy maglite was still sitting on the floor of the closet, its beam probably illuminating the very nightmare I was trying to keep contained. For a terrifying, agonizing span of 5 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged, whistling breaths echoing in the dark bedroom. Then came the sickening, distinct noise of a heavy body squeezing through the jagged drywall hole. I could hear the rough plaster scraping against their filthy, hardened clothes, followed immediately by the heavy, dull thud of a pair of knees dropping onto the closet floorboards. The sour, metallic stench of unwashed skin, rotting garbage, and ammonia seeped through the crack beneath the door, so thick and pungent I had to bite my own lip to keep from gagging. They were inside the closet, standing mere inches from my spine, separated only by an inch of cheap hollow wood. I braced my legs, waiting for the massive impact. I expected them to slam their shoulder against the wood, to yell, to try and batter their way blindly into the room. But they didn't. Instead, the brass doorknob I was gripping with both hands began to slowly, deliberately turn. It wasn't a frantic jiggle. It was a slow, terrifying exertion of immense, silent physical strength. The cold metal ground against my sweaty palms as I tried desperately to force it back, the internal latch squealing under the intense torque. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears of pure panic leaking down my cheeks as the door actually began to bow outward under their steady, pressing weight. I knew, with absolute, freezing certainty, that I couldn't hold them. If they broke through while I was braced against the door, I would be thrown to the floor, completely at their mercy. I had to run. I let go of the knob, shoved myself off the door with all my remaining strength, and blindly sprinted across the dark bedroom. Behind me, the closet door didn't just open, it exploded outward. The wood violently smashed against the bedroom drywall with a deafening crack that shook the floor under my feet. I hit the main bedroom door, my trembling, sweaty fingers fumbling uselessly with the deadbolt I had locked just an hour ago. Every microsecond felt like an eternity. I could hear the heavy, slapping sound of bare feet hitting the hardwood, closing the distance behind me in the dark. With a frantic, bloody twist, the deadbolt finally clicked. I ripped the door open, threw myself out into the pitch-black upstairs hallway, and slammed the door shut behind me, not even bothering to lock it. It wouldn't slow them down anyway. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving with dry sobs, and sprinted down the long, echoing corridor toward the main staircase. The house was a suffocating void of shadows. The only light was the pale, sickly glow of the street lamps bleeding through the downstairs windows. I reached the top of the stairs, my hand gripping the wooden banister so hard my joints popped. I was halfway down the first flight, my eyes fixed desperately on the front door at the end of the foyer, when a horrifying realization struck me, stopping me dead in my tracks. The heavy, slapping footsteps behind me in the upstairs hallway had completely stopped. The house was dead silent again. I stood frozen on the carpeted steps, staring into the dark foyer below, my heart doing a painful flip. Then, from directly beneath my feet, from inside the massive floor-level ventilation grate in the downstairs dining room, came the unmistakable hollow squeal of rusted metal. They hadn't followed me down the hallway. They knew the hidden arteries of this house better than I knew the floor plan. They had dropped straight down through the interior wall cavity, and they were already downstairs, blocking the exit. By a heavy, echoing clang as the massive louvered grate was tossed carelessly onto the hardwood floor. Then came a wet, meaty thud. They had dropped out of the wall and were standing directly between me and the front door. I was paralyzed halfway down the staircase, cloaked in the shadows of the second floor. If I ran down the remaining steps, I would be charging blindly into them in the pitch black. If I ran back up, I would be trapped in the bedrooms with absolutely no way out. The front door was a suicide run. My brain, flooded with pure, blinding adrenaline, calculated the only other option, the heavy glass sliding door in the kitchen at the back of the house. To get there, I had to reach the bottom of the stairs, slip through the living room, and bypass the dining room archway where they were currently standing. I descended the last 5 steps, pressing my back so hard against the wall I felt the plaster dig into my spine. I kept my weight entirely on the outside edges of the treads to avoid the deafening creaks of the old wood. Every ragged breath I took sounded like a siren in my own ears. I reached the bottom landing and crouched low, peering around the corner into the living room. The moonlight spilled across the floor, illuminating the wide archway that led to the dining room. Through the archway, I saw them. For the first time, they were standing completely upright. The figure was terrifyingly tall, their limbs long and emaciated beneath the layers of filthy, hardened clothes. They stood perfectly still in the center of the dining room, their head tilted at an unnatural angle, just listening. They were waiting for me to make a mistake. The metallic stench of their sweat and rotting garbage rolled off them in waves, so pungent it made my eyes water. Slowly, the figure turned toward the front foyer, their back facing my hiding spot. They took a slow, deliberate step away from the archway. It was my only window. I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled frantically across the living room rug, keeping the large sectional sofa between us. My heart hammered so violently against my ribs I genuinely thought it would snap them. I reached the edge of the kitchen linoleum, the cold floor biting into my bare palms, and scrambled behind the safety of the kitchen island. The sliding glass door was only 10 feet away. I stood up, keeping my head below the counter level, and lunged for the door. I grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge. In my paranoid frenzy days earlier, I had firmly wedged a thick wooden dowel into the bottom track of the door to prevent it from being forced open from the outside. Now it was sealing me in. My slick, sweating fingers fumbled blindly in the dark, desperately trying to pry the tight wood out of the metal track. It was jammed perfectly tight. I pulled harder, my nails breaking painfully against the aluminum frame. With a sudden, violent jerk, the dowel popped free. But it slipped from my sweaty grip. The heavy piece of wood hit the linoleum floor with a sharp, explosive clack that echoed like a gunshot through the entire first floor. I froze, my hand still hovering uselessly over the door handle. In the dining room, the heavy, slapping footsteps stopped instantly. Complete silence fell over the house once again. I squeezed my eyes shut, a pathetic whimper tearing at my throat. Then the footsteps started again. But they weren't slow or cautious anymore. They were heavy, fast, and deliberate. The floorboards shrieked as the figure pivoted and began charging toward the kitchen archway. They were coming. I had less than 2 seconds. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet resting on the stove, ripped the sliding glass door open, and threw myself out into the freezing night air just as a massive, filthy hand slammed against the glass behind me. I hit the freezing, rain-slicked grass of the backyard so hard my knees bruised, but I didn't stop moving. I sprinted blindly into the dark, my bare feet tearing on twigs and rocks, the heavy cast-iron skillet still gripped in my hand like a crude weapon. Behind me, the sliding glass door rattled violently in its aluminum frame, but the sickening sound of breaking glass never came. They didn't follow me outside. They didn't need to. They had already won. I scrambled over the low chain-link fence separating my property from the neighbors, ignoring the rusty metal biting into my palms, and threw myself onto their back porch. I pounded on their sliding door with the flat of the skillet, screaming until my voice cracked. It took 2 agonizing minutes before a porch light flicked on, and a terrified older man peered through the blinds. Seeing me, soaking wet, covered in drywall dust, bleeding from the scratches on my ribs, and wielding a frying pan, he didn't open the door, but he did call 911. Within 10 minutes, 3 police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of my sprawling, dark house, their red and blue lights painting the neighborhood in a frantic, strobing glow. I sat on the curb, shaking uncontrollably inside a foil shock blanket provided by the paramedics, and handed a skeptical officer my house keys. 4 cops went in, heavy flashlights raised, hands resting on their holstered weapons. I waited outside in the freezing rain for 2 hours. When the lead detective finally emerged from the front door, his face was the color of wet ash. He didn't look skeptical anymore. He looked sick. They hadn't found the intruder. By the time they breached the second floor, the figure had vanished, slipping out through a heavy iron foundation vent in the basement that had been meticulously unbolted from the inside. But what the police did find permanently altered the trajectory of my life. The detective sat down next to me on the wet curb, pulling out a small notepad, and explained the sheer, horrifying scale of what I had been living with. The nest I found behind my bedroom was just a drop in the bucket. The intruder hadn't just been hiding, they had terraformed the hidden architecture of my home. They had knocked out structural studs and carved jagged holes through the drywall behind almost every single closet on the second floor, creating a continuous hidden loop that allowed them to travel from room to room entirely within the walls. The police found empty food wrappers, human waste, and stolen clothing stuffed into the insulation above the guest bathroom. They found a crude makeshift periscope fashioned from hand mirrors in the HVAC ductwork that gave them a direct line of sight into my shower. Worst of all, the detective handed me a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was my missing set of house keys, the ones I had dropped in the bowl on the first floor weeks ago. They had been found resting neatly on the flattened sleeping bag in the crawl space. The intruder had been casually letting themselves out the front door while I was away at work. I never stepped foot inside that house again. I had movers pack up my belongings under police supervision, and I sold the property to an investment firm at a massive, ruinous loss. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted the title out of my name. It's been over a year now. I moved back into a cramped, noisy, high-rise apartment in the city. I hear my neighbors yelling. I hear their televisions, and I hear their heavy footsteps on my ceiling. Most people would hate it. I cherish it. The constant noise is a comfort. It means there are normal people around me. But the trauma doesn't just wash off. I still keep a heavy mag light on my nightstand. I still tape clear sewing thread across my bedroom door every single time I leave for the day. And on the quiet nights, when the city traffic dies down and the apartment building falls entirely silent, I find myself staring at the metal ventilation grates on my walls, waiting for the faint, deliberate sound of a heavy knuckle knocking back.